Why don't we open up with prayer, then we'll get started. Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity again to come together with like-minded patriots that are here in deep concern over our country. And we got to put you first again. We need to protect our freedoms that you gave us. And we're here to do that by learning more of our Constitution so that we can talk intelligently to our elected officials and keep them accountable and spread the news and educate people, get them motivated, get them activated to do something and stand for our freedoms that we have because of your sovereignty and what you gave us in this great nation. We thank you for all that you do, because without you, we have nothing. Thank you for this evening. Give our speaker great wisdom and knowledge in her words today. We thank you for her education and her knowledge that she's going to share with us, and just keep us attentive and help us leave here with the knowledge that we need to fight in this great fight that we're in. In Jesus' mighty name, amen. Amen. Well, a little introduction about our speaker tonight. She's going to be speaking on opposing the Article 5 Convention, and Miss Joanna Martin's here. Let's give her a hand. This is the fourth of 5 speeches that she'll be delivering in the 3 days that she has spoken in Myrtle Beach, Somerville, and Columbia, and is on her way to speak in Fort Mill. Many of us know her as Publius Hulda, as Publius Hulda is her nom de guerre. If you don't know what a nom de guerre is, it is the name somebody uses when engaged in an activity, especially fighting in war. And war is what we're in right now. We're in this war in America as a globalist coup is taking place to call an Article 5 convention and impose a new constitution to destroy our constitutional republic sovereignty. The remedy for this coup is an educated electorate that activates our state legislatures into completely opposing the call for an Article 5 convention. And today, we are doing, you guessed it, we are educating the electorate to activate our own South Carolina state legislature to oppose the call for an Article 5 convention. Joanna Martin is a lawyer, a philosopher, and a logician. She is a strict constitutionalist of the United States Constitution. She is passionate about the Federalist Papers from Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. She is passionate about restoring constitutional government. She is also passionate about the Bible and a follower of Jesus Christ. People on the opposing side of the Article 5 debate have often slandered her in order to try to stop others from listening to the truth that she delivers. When she is slandered, she reminds people of the quote from Socrates, who reportedly said, "When the debate is lost, slander is the weapon of the loser." Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speaker, one of the top leaders in America, helping us to save our constitutional republic, Joanna Martin.
Thank you. Well, it's a great honor to be here. Thank you. I have a stack of original source documents which prove everything I say. You'll be getting a handout sheet which has my email address on it. So please email me and I'll send you the exhibit list, which has links to all of my documents. I was a trial lawyer and I have the proof for everything I say. To usher in the Great Reset, the New World Order, the globalists must get rid of our Constitution. To get rid of our Constitution, they need Congress to call an Article 5 convention. And to get Congress to call an Article 5 convention, 34 state legislatures must apply for it. That's what the push for an Article 5 convention is all about, getting a new Constitution. Article 5 of our Constitution provides two methods of amending it. Congress proposes amendments or calls a convention to propose amendments if 2/3 of the state legislatures apply for it. The first method was used for the existing 27 amendments. Congress proposed them and sent them to the states for ratification. Under the second method, Congress calls a convention. We've never had a convention under Article 5. They are dangerous. And James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, 4 U.S. Supreme Court justices, and many other legal scholars warn against it because a constitution gives the enemies of our Constitution the opportunity to get rid of it and impose a new one. Our enemies have been pushing for a convention for 60 years, ever since the Ford Foundation produced the Constitution for the New States of America. Read this and tremble for your country. Among other horrors, we are disarmed under this Constitution. In the past, conservatives defeated the periodic pushes for a convention. So Mark Meckler's organization, the so-called Convention of States Project, COS, repackaged a convention to appeal to conservatives. They now claim that the only way to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government is to amend our Constitution, and we can only get amendments to do that at a convention. With this Constitution, we created a federation of states united under a national government only for the limited purposes enumerated in the Constitution. We listed every power we granted to the national government. All our Constitution authorizes the national government to do over the country at large falls into 4 categories. 1, military defense, international commerce and relations. 2, immigration and naturalization. 3, establish a commercial system with uniform weights and measures, patents and copyrights, a money system based on gold and silver, bankruptcy laws, mail delivery, and some road building, and 4, with some of the amendments, secure certain civil rights. That's it. All other powers are reserved by the states or the people. This chart, and you'll get a copy of this shortly, illustrates the federal structure of our government and lists the powers delegated to the national government. It's a short list. We are a nation only for the limited purposes listed here. It's only with respect to these enumerated powers that the national government has lawful authority. If it's on the list, Congress may make laws about it. But if it's not on the list, Congress usurps power and acts unlawfully when it meddles. But this knowledge has been forgotten. That's why the federal government turned into Frankenstein. Everybody ignores the Constitution because we didn't know the enumerated powers and didn't care enough to learn. The federal government was able to usurp thousands of powers not on the list. State and local governments collaborated with the usurpations by taking federal funds to implement unconstitutional federal programs. To claim these problems can be fixed by amending our Constitution makes as much sense as saying that since people violate the 10 Commandments, God should amend the 10 Commandments. But Meckler's organization, COS, insists the problem is the Constitution. But obviously, the claim that we can control those who ignore the Constitution by amending the Constitution is absurd. Mark Levin pushes for a convention and claims we will get amendments to limit the federal government. But his so-called liberty amendments do the opposite of what he claims. His amendment to limit the federal bureaucracy legalizes what are now unconstitutional federal agencies: education, energy, agriculture, environmental protection, health and human services, etc., etc., etc. Our Constitution doesn't authorize these agencies. They are not on the list. But Levin's amendment legalizes all such agencies for as long as Congress approves them. Article 1, Section 1 of our Constitution says only Congress may make laws. But since Woodrow Wilson, federal executive agencies have been writing rules. This is the Code of Federal Regulations. All these rules are unconstitutional as outside the scope of powers delegated and as in violation of Article 1, Section 1. But Levin's amendment to limit the federal bureaucracy legalizes these rules and the rulemaking process for as long as Congress approves the rules. Levin's amendment to limit federal spending is a knife in the gut of our Constitution. Our Constitution limits federal spending to the enumerated powers. If you go through the Constitution and highlight all the powers delegated to Congress and the President, you will have a complete list of the objects on which Congress is authorized to spend money. That's how our Constitution controls spending, but everyone ignores it. Levin's amendment substitutes a budget for the enumerated powers and thus legalizes the current system where Congress spends money on whatever is put in the budget. His amendment thus changes the constitutional standard for spending from whether the object is an enumerated power and creates a completely new constitutional authority to spend on whatever Congress or the President want to spend on and put in the budget. It thus transforms our Constitution from one of enumerated powers only to one of unlimited powers. And while his amendment pretends to impose a limit on the amount of spending, the limit is fictitious because it can be waived whenever Congress votes to waive it. During 2016, COS staged a 3-day simulated convention at Williamsburg, Virginia, supposedly to show that at a convention called by Congress under Article 5, the delegates would do nothing more than come up with wise amendments to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. COS invited Republican state legislators to attend, and they proposed 6 amendments which vastly increase the powers of the federal government. One amendment would delegate to the federal government powers such as I witnessed 45 plus years ago in Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. It delegates to the federal government power over the movement and transportation of persons across state lines. This would provide constitutional authority for the federal government to do such things as require prior approval to cross state lines, require internal passports as in the Soviet Union, establish checkpoints at state borders, and ban use of privately owned vehicles to cross state lines. The other amendments are just as bad They're all discussed in this flyer. None of their proposed amendments, not one, limits the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. They do the opposite. They grant new powers or legalize powers the feds have already usurped. There is no amendment on the face of this earth which can make those who ignore the existing limits in the Constitution obey the Constitution. When the feds usurp powers not delegated, and when state and local governments accept federal funds to implement unconstitutional federal programs, all of them are ignoring the existing constitutional limits on federal powers. So their claim that we can get amendments to rein in the power and jurisdiction of the federal government is false. There is another agenda. COS claims the framers added the convention method of getting amendments to Article 5 so that when the federal government violates the Constitution, we could rein them in by amending the Constitution. But James Madison kept a journal of the Federal Convention of 1787. Here it is. I went through it page by page and pulled out every reference to what became Article 5. None of the framers said what COS claims. Instead, the framers agreed that the purpose of amendments is to fix defects in the Constitution. They also recognized that the purpose of a convention is to get a new constitution. The anti-federalists at the convention hated this Constitution. Anti-Federalist George Mason said on August the 31st, 1787, that he would sooner chop off his right hand than put it to the Constitution as it now stands, and if it weren't changed to suit his views, he wanted another convention. Now, our framers knew that our Declaration of Independence recognizes that a people have the self-evident right to throw off their government and set up a new one, and thus have the right to meet and draft a new constitution, whether the convention method were in Article 5 or not. So the convention method was added to Article 5, and it provided a second way to get amendments, but it also provided a way to get a new constitution under the pretext of getting amendments. So even before the ink was dry on this Constitution, the anti-federalists were agitating for another convention to get rid of it. James Madison warned that people who secretly want to get rid of our Constitution would push for a convention under the pretext of getting amendments, and that's what's going on today. This flyer has the proof, including links to 3 of Jefferson's letters where he said precisely this. So during April 1788, John Jay, who became our first U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison began warning against another constitution. The push for an Article 5 convention has always been about getting a new constitution. COS claims that Congress has nothing to do with the convention except name the time and place of the initial meeting. But our Constitution contradicts that. Our Constitution shows at Article 5 that Congress calls the convention, and at Article 1, Section 8, last clause, that Congress has the power to make the laws necessary and proper to carry out its powers to call the convention. The 2014 report of the Congressional Research Service shows that Congress recognizes that it has exclusive authority to organize the convention, and that in Congress's preparations for conventions in the past, Congress has shown that it will determine, among other things, the number and selection process for delegates. Congress can select the delegates. They can select themselves. The proof is on this flyer. COS also claims that delegates have no power to do anything except rubber stamp decisions dictated by state legislatures. But that also isn't in Article 5. COS made it up. Article 5 shows that the only power the states have is to ask Congress to call a convention. Once 2/3 of the states have applied, it's out of the states' hands. COS claims to know exactly how a convention will operate, but page 27 of the CRS report says, quote, "In the final analysis, the question, what sort of convention, is not likely to be resolved unless or until the 34-state threshold has been crossed and a convention assembles," end quote. So we'll have to get a convention before we know how it is going to operate. COS says a convention is safe because 3/4 of the states have to ratify whatever comes out. That's not true. Our Declaration of Independence recognizes the right of a people to alter or abolish their government and set up a new government. We invoked that right in 1776 to throw off the British monarchy. In 1787, we threw off our first constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and we set up a new constitution, this one which created a new government. How did we get from our first constitution to our second constitution? There was a convention called to propose amendments to our first constitution. The Continental Congress resolved on February the 21st, 1787, to call a convention, quote, "for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation," end quote. But the delegates ignored that limitation, and they ignored the limitations from their states, and they wrote our second constitution. And in Federalist Paper number 40, James Madison, known as the father of our Constitution, invoked that transcendent and precious right of a people to throw off one government and set up a new one as justification for ignoring their instructions and writing a new constitution. Here's the proof. You can't stop that from happening at another convention. If we have a convention now, George Washington, James Madison, Ben Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton won't be there. Who will be there? Constitutionally illiterate people, such as those who attended the COS convention, and persons of insidious views to steer them to the predetermined outcome, which is almost certainly a third constitution. Or Congress can select themselves as delegates. The pretended president of the Senate, Kamala Harris, was George Soros's choice for vice president. She could be chairman of the convention. A third constitution will have its own new mode of ratification. Our first constitution required the Continental Congress and all of the then 13 states to approve amendments. But our second constitution drafted at the Amendments Convention of 1787, provided at Article 7 that it would require only 9 states for ratification. If we have another convention, nothing can stop the delegates from proposing a third constitution with its own new mode of ratification. The Constitution for the new states of America is ratified by a national referendum called by the president. Who controls the voting machines? They will get whatever they want ratified. Under this Constitution, the states are to be dissolved and replaced by regional governments answerable to the new national government. Here is the Constitution for the new Socialist Republic in North America, proposed by the Revolutionary Communist Party, USA. The Constitution 2020 movement is backed by George Soros. He wants a Marxist constitution. This is the task force report on the North American Union by the Globalist Council on Foreign Relations. This provides for, among other horrors, a parliament to be set up over and above Canada, the United States, and Mexico. This is altogether repugnant to our existing Constitution. Before they can move us into the North American Union, they need a convention to get rid of this. The National Constitution Center has a Constitution drafting project. They have proposed 3 new constitutions. Here is the Progressive Constitution. Here is the Libertarian Constitution. Here is the, quote, conservative, end quote, Constitution. All of these 3 constitutions delegate massive new powers to the federal government. They eliminate the natural-born citizen requirement to be president. The Libertarian Constitution has open borders. The so-called conservative and progressive constitutions provide for the election of president by national popular vote. There's a long list of horrors in these constitutions. Sexual orientation and sexual preference and abortion are expressly granted constitutional rights in the Progressive Constitution. Pedophilia, bestiality would be constitutionally protected rights. And know this, the National Constitution Center is a quasi-official branch of the federal government. Its website address contains www.usa.gov/federal agencies. Getting a new constitution to replace our existing constitution appears to be federal government policy. You have to be insane to want Congress to call an Article 5 convention. But COS says there's no danger in getting a new constitution because delegates can be controlled by faithful delegate laws. That's absurd. Just as state legislatures and the Continental Congress couldn't control the delegates to the Federal Amendments Convention of 1787, they can't control delegates to an Amendments Convention today. Our Declaration of Independence recognizes the power of the people to form, modify, or abolish their government. So the delegates can, like James Madison, exercise that self-evident right recognized in our Declaration of Independence, to throw off the governments we have and write a new constitution which moves us into a new system of government. And since it will have its own mode of ratification, it's sure to be approved. COS says, well, we'll make it a felony to violate state instructions. That is silly. First, remember, Congress has no obligation to permit the states to select delegates. Two, I started out as a criminal defense lawyer. You can't get a conviction of someone who exercises what our Declaration of Independence recognizes as a self-evident right. Third, it's easy to circumvent faithful delegate laws. On May the 29th, 1787, at the Federal Amendments Convention, the delegates voted to make their proceedings secret. If delegates can do that again, and they can vote by secret ballot, this is why James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, 4 U.S. Supreme Court justices, and many other legal scholars warn against an Article 5 convention. I implore anyone who supports a convention to read this flyer and ask, is it possible that James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Chief Justice John Jay, Justice Arthur Goldberg, Chief Justice Warren Burger, and Justice Antonin Scalia, and the other legal scholars understand something about the dangers of a convention which you haven't yet grasped? James Madison warned of violent partisans and individuals of insidious views being at a convention. Are there people like that today? Yes, and they want a convention. But COS says only moral and wise people will be delegates. Let's look at that claim. There are 3 ways to select delegates. Would Congress appoint moral and wise delegates? Would state governments appoint moral and wise delegates? If it's determined by popular election, popular vote, would the people who control the voting machines appoint moral and wise delegates? Moral and wise people haven't been in charge of our country for over 100 years, and that's because we have been sitting on our hands. And now federal spending. The Pew Report says for fiscal year 2017, 31.9% of the revenue the South Carolina state government got was from federal funds. And that's a pittance compared to the additional federal funds sent into South Carolina to local governments, non-governmental organizations, research grants, price supports, subsidies, Medicare, Social Security, etc., etc. We cannot rant and rave about how we need a balanced budget amendment to rein in federal spending when we have our hands out for all that money. And all that money, and the money sent to the 49 other states year after year after year, is added to the national debt. And all that spending is unconstitutional. I say, let's enforce these and downsize the federal government to its enumerated powers. Amendments don't control governments which ignore the Constitution. The First Amendment didn't stop them from banning Christian speech in the public square. The Second Amendment didn't stop them from restricting guns and ammo. The Fourth Amendment didn't stop them from spying on us without a warrant. The Fifth Amendment didn't stop them from uncompensated regulatory takings. And the 10th Amendment didn't stop them from usurping thousands of other powers. South Carolina doesn't appear to now have any applications for a convention on file with Congress. However, earlier this year, the South Carolina House passed H. 3205, which is Mark Meckler's application for an Article 5 convention. We must defeat this in the Senate next year. For the love of God, your country, and your progeny, get familiar with this issue and get with your state senators. They do not understand this issue, and they have been deceived by the convention lobby's false and reckless assurances. So what's the solution? James Madison said, "Our Constitution depends on the people having the virtue and wisdom to select men of virtue and wisdom to office." But we lost our virtue and intelligence. We replaced truth with convenient lies. We abandoned personal responsibility, and we didn't learn these and elect people who would enforce them. We cannot restore our republic unless we face up to our patriotic and moral duties. 2, don't go along with the usurpations. Our Declaration of Independence says colonial legislatures opposed the king's violations, the king's invasions on the rights of the people. Today, states must oppose violations of our Constitution. Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison said, since the states created the federal government when they ratified the Constitution, the states are the final authority on whether their creature has violated the constitutional compact the states made with each other. And when the federal government usurps powers not delegated, each state has the natural right to nullify of their own authority all such acts of the federal government. The refusal to submit to unconstitutional acts is the remedy our framers advised when the federal government violates the Constitution. Understand, nullification is not a mere constitutional right. Instead, it is that natural right of self-defense which predates and pre-exists the Constitution. And of course, state and local governments must stop taking the money to implement unconstitutional federal programs. It was the states and local governments who sold our reserved powers to the federal governments, just as Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of porridge. The states and local governments did the same. So, what is the push for a convention really about? We know our Constitution already limits the federal government to the enumerated powers. We know our framers told the states to refuse to go along with unconstitutional acts of the federal government. We know that everyone has ignored our Constitution for 100 years. We know that the proposed amendments increase the powers of the federal government. We know that amendments can't control governments which ignore the Constitution. We know that delegates can't be controlled. We know that a new Constitution can be imposed, and we know that new constitutions are already prepared. The globalists are spending millions to get a convention. Why? Our Constitution is preventing the political integration of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Globalists need a convention so they can complete their coup against us and get a new constitution which transforms us from a sovereign nation to a member state in the North American Union. Read the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations Task Force. That is what the elite want of both political parties. But to get that, they have to get rid of this. Or the violent mobs who intimidated the jurors in the Chauvin trial may surround the convention and demand the Constitution proposed by the Revolutionary Communist Party, USA, or the progressive Marxist Constitution Soros wants. Or the Chinese communists might direct their puppets in Congress to impose the Constitution the Chinese communists want. Or the convention may propose one of the three constitutions proposed by the National Constitution Center. And remember, any new constitution has its own mode of ratification. If the mode is by national referendum, we're done for. Our enemies stole the last presidential election and took away our right to elect the president. And since the essence of a republic is that power is exercised by representatives elected by the people, our republic was overthrown in the last election. Now they want to take our Constitution away. But this and the mercy of God is all that is standing between us and the hell of the New World Order, the global reset. Our enemies control Congress. If Congress calls a convention, our enemies will be able to impose a new constitution.